right, Zach, it's a pleasure to welcome you. It's been, I think, must have been 3 years or so since we last recorded something publicly. Maybe just spoke to each other a couple years before that. You're one part to the pseudonymous author David J. Temple, which is a new advent since we last spoke. And there's a book out at the moment, I believe, titled First Principles and First Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta-Crisis and the World to Come. You're the author of Education in a Time Between Worlds, many other works. And I have a tremendous interest in your perspective across all of these topics, really. I have a sense of perhaps how to proceed today. As I mentioned, there's a couple deep tensions that over the course of this dialogue I hope to bring to the fore for the sake of working with them well. And now that I have presence that, I am in fact not going to launch into an effort to cobble things together just yet. One of the things I did really like, though, about how you are framing the worldview, I suppose, the position you're taking with respect to the history of philosophy, spirituality, the future of religion, metaphysics, these types of things, is with the language of an evolving perennialism. I really like that. I think it speaks to one of these tensions, and for some might come across as a paradox. This has always been of deep interest to me in my thinking. So what does that mean, an evolving perennialism? Why does that matter?
Yeah, it's a great way to start, actually. Yeah, I mean, David J. Temple emerged from the perennial impulse, the perennial impulse being the impulse to see something common across all the religious traditions, all the wisdom traditions, if you will. It was a project that was kind of initiated by Karl Jaspers, taken up by Aldous Huxley, originally started with Comenius and Leibniz way back in the 1600s. You get this discourse that begins to be reflective about all the great traditions, a discourse that is looking for the perennially recurring themes of wisdom. And this is one of the things in my early, it was in my 20s and I was first doing philosophy of religion. This was one of the things that just really captivated me because it captivated John Coltrane, captivated Sun Ra, captivated the great American jazz musicians who were who were enslaved and therefore brought into a foreign tradition, which would be Christianity, and yet Christianity was their tradition. So they were looking for something deeper than Christianity within Christianity. And this is the link up and into this perennial discourse, the most ancient discourse about the nature of the universe and how it relates to the nature of the human. The perennialism that we know comes from the kind of Aldous Huxley tradition. And this was a tradition that, in our view, kind of overemphasized the static and eternal and changeless. So it was like a Vedanta-based kind of mind-only kind of view where he articulated some very profound universal truths across all religions. And we kind of outline those in the book and say this was an incredible start. And yet, when you look at cultural evolution and you look at the individual psychological development that people go through, you start to see that there are truths that are both eternal and evolving. That it's actually an error to think of the perennial insights as static and unchanging, having been re-articulated again and again, unchanging since 30,000 BC, right? Which is the Huxleyan view, which is a profound view because it says you're touching when you read the Vedas, or you're touching when you read, the Hebrew wisdom tradition. You're touching this ancient conversation and this ancient insight that has not changed about, for example, the sacredness of personhood or the sacredness of beauty, right? Or that your mind is somehow in touch with a universal one mind, which is the core of the kind of Huxley-based Vedanta perennialism. And that view is noble, but it became impossible to defend. Late in modernity, it became impossible to defend against post-modernity 100%, because it was too static a view of what the grammar of value was, if you will. It was not allowing for the infinite, unique permutations of unchanging truths, which is one way to think about the physical manifestation, biological manifestation of evolution, is just this iterating on very simple truths. But the iterations make increasing complexity to the extent where you get gorgeous, unique manifestations of the need for survival, for example, which is universal, and yet survival for me is not survival for you, is not survival for the squirrel, is not survival for the paramecium, and so on, right? So it's like, so we're looking for these eternal, evolving first principles and first values of cosmos, which were mentioned throughout the traditions, but usually mistaken as eternal in that simple, unchanging, beneath time sense. And we're trying to argue that it is that and uniquely evolving in temporality, cross-perspectival, cross-cultural history. And so personhood is a very important one. And so, for example, you get and McGilchrist tells this story, and you also find it in someone like James C. Scott and his work on the deep history of the early civilizations. We were burying like we were burying people with adornments, with obvious ceremonial circumstance, long before there's archaeological evidence that we were using propositionally differentiated speech to pass on complex tools, for example. So like we're respecting personhood in this very deep intuitive way by taking care of the dead sapien before we're able to explain why we are doing that. Later we get myth. Myth begins to explain why it is we have these rites, not rights in the RIGT sense, but RITE, right, in the sense of a rite or a ritual. So the rite that surrounds burial, the rituals of burial precede the mythic explanation of why it is done. And similarly, in early childhood, you get the ritualized sacred nexus of attachment, pre-linguistic, obviously heavily valued, but not able to be explained, the sacred value of the personhood. And so deeper than any explanation is the existence of this thing, personhood, which then our relation to evolves in this massively beautiful and complex and protracted dance with the inviolability, uniqueness, ultimate sacredness of each individual person. But how can that be? Because there's so many people. So somehow we're all equally sacred. It took a long time to work that one out. Like we have not completely worked that out. But we were saying that in ancient Mesopotamia, the Hebrew wisdom tradition says that very early, but is echoing these perennial calls for the respect of personhood. So we call that the sacred complex that rests on the eye of value, which is just the perception of value, eternal value, which evolves. So the evolving perennialism is that it is this attempt to resuscitate the perennial tradition in the strict sense, meaning like, let's not forget that discourse about the fact that all the religions are kind of saying the same thing. Like that was like an incredible insight. Now, it didn't withstand post-modernity and et cetera, so we need to do some work there. And we've done that work in the book. We've begun to do that work. So there's that, rescuing that discourse, but then there's also just what that discourse is pointing to, which is in fact the existence of these eternally recurring first principles and first values, both prior to culture and in culture. So that's maybe a place to start.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm in sort of an interesting position where I find a lot of your work exceptionally deep and also obvious,
Mm. Mhm.
which is it seems to be like an appropriate combination.
Yes, that's good. That's the definition of philosophy for me. Like that was,
Right.
it's something that you work months and months and months to formulate a very clear, or even years to formulate a very clear formulation of something. And then you finally say it. And it's so obvious that your grandma already knew that. That is often good philosophy, but also perennialism, right? It's basically like, if we really clarify it, you've already seen it. Like you know, like I can't teach you something you don't already know. I can do
Right.
sophistry and lead you astray into things you don't know. But ultimately, value is always already present in the field of
Right.
your being, and perception. Yeah.
Right. That's where I speak that from, for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah.
It is curious, though, of course, because we interact in contexts in which finding one's way home, sharing the effort at finding one's way home, and sharing what matters in a way that supports the possibility for connection, let alone to actually connect with someone, just to stay in the process long enough, given how far it can feel we are away, and yet at the same time to actually walk that path in some critical sense. You're already on the path and you're not actually needing to find your way home. It turns out there you are. And so we have ways into that sort of paradoxical language of the always
Mm.
already and this type of thing, which would speak to the perennial aspect. And then on the evolution side, I'm wondering if we could make a little bit of a jump here. Then
Mm.
we'll get some pieces onto the Gestalt. So I spoke to Alexander Bard a few weeks ago, and that was released as a podcast last week. And I know you're somewhat familiar, at least with the top line meme that he refers to as the Bard Absolute with two R's, Bard as in locked or prohibited from, the Bard Absolute. Can I just ask you openly how you relate to that notion? And I can attempt to share how I understand it, how I've wrestled with it, where I would consider it to be conceived inadequately, where there might be a promise there, and how that might potentially relate in the context of religion's sacredness and the context we're speaking about. So I can do that if you'd like, or
Yeah, please
just
preamble,
take
because
it.
I know Bard's work, but I don't know that concept well enough to actually just kind of opine on it.
Right. Well, I'm more interested in what the concept's pointing to than I am in taking on the position of Bard here. I wouldn't claim to do that. And I'm not ultimately interested in that, apart from for the sake of, I mean, that would kind of like be something in service to discourse, which again is relevant, um, might be relevant insofar as we participate in the evolution of perennialism together, but not, let's say, what the essence of perennialism might be speaking to. And in a lot of this work, in a lot of my approach here, I speak from a rootedness in that place, or an attempt to. Anyway, so the notion of the Bard Absolute, in terms of what I think is most interesting about it, in the context of education, it would be that which is mm, a an appropriately, well, again, whether appropriate or not is going to depend, but let's say an appropriately constructed barrier between, you know, Bard would say something like pornography and the child, because there's not a readiness or appropriateness yet for the developing psyche to relate with this. You could also make that case from the perspective of from the cultural perspective as well. So then we might, and then if I might come up with some other examples at a level of more adult criticality, I would consider the degree to which, let's say, you and I, in context together, had an intention to enter the kind of process that we, whether through a sense of a kind of enthusiasm for possibility or potential, in that sense, you could see it through a portal of ecstasis. You could also see it through a sense of necessity in terms of relating with difference and potential conflict. Let's say that there is something about that process we might recognize is going to demand something of what it means to navigate identity, in a sense, the previously fixed boundaries, in that sense, potentially to engage in the very essence of a particular kind of criticality of evolving perennialism in context together. This type of thing I can imagine and have known to be profoundly destabilizing and inappropriate for whether people who have not um, chosen to be there is too basic, but there are places for certain initiations and processes that need to take place, which it seems require a certain sort of protection around the membrane itself. I could even think of a football pitch and a game. You have 60,000 people gathered in a stadium, and yet it's not appropriate for any of the supporters to cross that boundary in order for the activity, which was in some sense, the critical event of that gathered context to become.
I see.
So in there is not how I'm trying to say to you, here's what it means. I'm pointing towards a few instances in which a very important kind of privacy, for reasons that I think are metaphysically interesting to relate with in terms of how they meet and inform the nature of religious structure, gathering structure, formation structure, which I think are super important from the perspectives of education and and cultivating valueception. Do you call it that? Valueception.
Valueception is a term I got from McGilchrist, who he got from somebody. We talk about the eye of value, but I often talk about valueception because those both mean basically the same thing.
Right.
So this, please continue.
Well, that's just an attempt to furnish some of the nature of the concept in terms of its application and place in your own thinking. I know you have had a conversation with Mark Gaffney and Alexander Bard where there was a little bit of talk about this, and Bard will talk about things like, equate, there's the holy of holies, and that's inside the temple, and the public can't access it, and it's not even what you think is the thing that should be accessed. It turns out there's another room, and look, I spoke to how that could be interpreted in a vulgar way, in a sense of like a C.S. Lewis inner ring. And what I'm most interested in is actually what it is to relate with the dynamic of critically closed interiors as such, what it is to relate you and I with obviously people in general, with the prospect of participating in a manner that enables the appropriate traversing of membranes. I'm interested in from an ethical perspective how a religion in that sense treats the dynamism of spirit, all these types of things. That's why I raised this up as like
Right.
as a
Totally.
point to bring in.
Yeah. I mean, it's the nature of the discourse that we're trying to convene with evolving perennialism and cosmoerotic humanism is, in many sense, it's just a discourse about value. And value theory hinges a lot, as you can imagine, around what's called norms or normativity. And another way to think about that is law. The law. Like, how do you make a law? How does that work? And on whose authority is such a law given? And is the law real? Meaning, does the law actually cleave reality at the joints? And so that's this question about natural law, which is one of the things that we're kind of trying to resuscitate as well. We also have a great C.S. Lewis quote in there. He's also a perennialist, right? And natural law, which emerges out of kind of medieval Christianity, but this source is, of course, in the Hebrew wisdom tradition, which goes back to the repurposing of basically ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian legal structures. It's a very complex legal setup back there, interestingly enough, in terms of the way you get this thing we call civilization, the way you get these things you call city-states, are with taxation, legal structure, the repurposing of the written word, or actually the first purposing of the written word. The reason we first invented the written word was for taxation and legal codification for the aggregation of post-Dunbar level urban centers, which ran on taxation beyond the ability to do mnemonic device and kind of like word of mouth. You need to scribble down and take records of the taxes, and then you need to have records of why you have records, and so you start to get legal systems. And so that's this emergence kind of out of, quote, the kind of natural state of these written legal codes. And Hammurabi, I think. Maharabi, I think was the guy. Maharabi's code, right, was one of the first ones. So, but this is just this deep point about ancient discourse on law. And law is very much about don't go here, right? Like, if this happens to the orphan, then that happens to the, right? If this happens to the, and much of it was very specific. And it was rooted in the secular within worldly powers of the kings, who were on par with the gods, who all lived in the visible realm, more or less. Forgive me my crude anthropology here, but I'm trying to kind of reconstruct law. So law begins in this sacred complex.
Hammurabi. Now I remember
Hammurabi,
you're speaking.
yes.
The guy who wrote down, you got to do this and that. Yeah.
Yeah, Hammurabi, who he solidified the very first empire. And one of the ways that worked was through actually carving on these huge stone things, law, legal systems. And these were words that encoded action, meaning like set the behaviors for thousands and thousands of people. So you get this emergence of the Hebrew wisdom tradition, which ties law not to the within worldly power of some sovereign who sits equal to the within worldly other gods, but ties law to a completely transcendent source, and therefore ties writing and the sacred complex and the legal system to some type of evolving discussion that tries to get law in touch with what is actually true, what is actually the will of God, should be the law of people. Not the king's law should be the law of people, because the king was really crafty in terms of how he dealt with these other gods within the realm. But in fact, no, there is one lawgiver, King of Kings, who dictates, etc. And so you get this whole emerging discussion about the origin of the legitimate dictation of law, which is backed by the ostensibly legitimate use of the means of coercion, i.e. force, violence. So then you get that, this very intense ability to back law with violence to create sacred spaces through the control of violence. So law, violence, the sacred begin to co-evolve. And all of this is about the ability to have a non-arbitrary discussion about what is valuable and what we all should be doing, right? How do we have a non-arbitrary discussion, not resolved by mere power or something, but a non-arbitrary discussion about the nature of reality, which is to say, what's actually the case with how it ought to be between us, given what has happened, right? And these are questions for a value realist. A value realist would be someone who believes value is real. Therefore, you can make law in relation to a field of value. most of modernism is value nominalist, and they call themselves they're legal nominalists, which means that the law is just the law. It's whatever we make it. There is no way you could carve nature at the joints, right? And actually like make a divine law that would somehow be in keeping with the nature of the cosmos. That's a weird pre-modern thought. We modern people know that the universe is a meaningless, evolving machine made out of matter that has no ulterior purpose or motive, certainly doesn't value the things that we value. So a law is arbitrary codification of relativistic human value. That's modern legal theory, basically. It's hard to actually maintain human rights and other things under strictly nominalistic legal conditions. And so that means that this idea that there is some actually sacred line to be drawn by the law, right? For example, around the inviolability of personhood with regards to privacy. The idea that that line is sacred because that is the line the universe, that is the line that exists in the universe, right? It's a vector of reality, that as opposed to saying, well, no, not really, there's nothing there. There's no actually inviolable nature of personhood. That's like a strange metaphysical belief that you have. We all know that there's no free will, and we all know that the universe doesn't have any purpose. So therefore, come on, our legal codes are as arbitrary as they could possibly be. Certainly less arbitrary than like an engineering decision, which actually deals with the laws of physics. The idea that a legal decision would deal with the laws of X, what? The laws of what? The laws of magic or something, which would be the way that the hardcore scientists would view it. So this question of how to actually bring modern scientific metaphysics into a conversation with the legal system that doesn't fundamentally undermine the legal system. Habermas started worrying about this back in the day with neuroscience advancing to the point where the neuroscientists started saying we didn't have free will. And it was like, okay, guys, but then what do we do with this whole legal system, which runs on the idea of that? And his argument was that this insight that we have, that value is non-arbitrary, which is the foundation of modern legal realism, which also exists, which is rooted in kind of a natural law thinking, which is more where I believe Habermas is at. Habermas is basically saying that should make us rethink our assumptions about what the science shows us. And in fact, the science doesn't show us anything like that. There is no free will. That's a separate conversation. But the broader point I'm trying to make is that the ability to draw a non-arbitrary legal framework. How do we evaluate the legal framework? Is it in terms of the efficiency by which it allows the economy to operate? Right. And so this is when I did my dissertation, it was about the frameworks of John Rawls, who was trying to figure out how do you actually, prior to society, evaluate the goodness or badness of some constitution or set of legal frameworks, which is to say some set of boundaries, some set of legal sacred containers around value, which to protect value, to enhance value. So that's a little bit of my thinking there. And then in the context of teacherly authority, this is where it really grounds home, because, when the legal system is irrational, you get all kinds of terrible stuff. But when the legal system / worldview is irrational, it becomes very hard to be a teacher, right? Because at the end of the day, the teacher needs to be able to have a non-arbitrary discussion about the nature of the good life, meaning this outcome of an adolescent identity crisis is preferable to that outcome of an adolescent identity crisis for these reasons, which can be shared and are not perceived as arbitrary, because then it's a non-resolution. It's like, well, we think it's better, but it's not actually better. That's not a resolution of that. That's a non-resolution of that. Like it's a retreat to relativism, and the time for that has kind of passed, because we're in a situation where we no longer have the default common sense sacred axioms of modernity, which we're running off of the legacy of pre-modernity, to kind of shore up our inarticulacies about the nature of a life that has not been misspent and the nature of a virtuous human. And so now we have very little to say about what makes one way of being a person better than another way of being a person. Even that framing is controversial. So all the performative contradictions of the kind of late postmodern cultural landscape begin to emerge. And then in that, you get, as William Irwin Thompson kind of predicted, this kind of like crazy soup of mimetic chaos out of which reality starts to congeal. Because nobody wants to not be in touch with reality. And then the field of value is always already there. So value realism will reemerge. And in personal life, when you are out of touch with value, you get crisis moments, right? Where reality smacks you in the face, right? Basically, is the experience. And these are, adolescent midlife crises, identity crises of our perception of value, the way we value ourselves, the things that we value, and therefore the way we act and behave. So there are major, what's called transvaluations in individual living, meaning like the way you used to even justify your decisions when you were 10/15. Those reasons aren't even admissible to your current justification system for making sense of your decisions, right? So there's like transvaluations of whole ways of reasoning about what is valuable. That occurs also at the civilizational level, right? So back to the legal frameworks, right? The feudal system involved very complex legal structures as part of Christian natural law, but ultimately grounded in a theological discourse and a discourse about the divine right of kings, right? Fast forward 150 years through the 30 Years' War and all this stuff. The idea of the divine right of kings is like, we'll get you laughed out of all the major universities, and the legal systems are detached from theological discourse, which means that whole prior way of justifying law is inadmissible. So it's a radical transvaluation, not just of what we value, not the list of value changed, the way we justify, the way we perceive, the way we think about value, the whole thing transvaluates, right? So we're in the midst of one of those now. That's one way to think about education and time between worlds. It's time between consistent, in the midst of transvaluation. So it's right to focus on that notion of how do we draw that sacred line? How do we draw these boundaries? And how do we actually find language to protect, the valuable?
And one part of it is the drawing boundaries, which is to say the language. And then there's the praxis, and there's the movement, and there's the affectivity. You could speak about it in terms of, I heard you speak there mostly from a third person perspective in terms of, okay, if we look at this, let's take a step back, let's situate ourselves in the context of civilization, the evolution of the human being, how we've come to justify the good. One of the ways that I have tremendous appreciation for that frame of education in a time between worlds, and of course the position that we live in a time between worlds. And from that perspective, from that third person perspective, I agree. From the perspective of meeting life in the context of, well, first and second person differently, it would seem to me that we are always, in some sense, relating the liminality of what it is to be in process of transvaluation as such would seem to be part and parcel of actually the cultivation of a human life. If we talk about the pre-tragic, tragic, and the post-tragic in that regard, just as one type of orientation for becoming. So is that's fair to say that actually we should differentiate here between third person perspectives and then first and second person ways of relating with this notion? I found that to be quite important, and it's the time at which I could speak forth and be like, I'm not so sure about that time between worlds thing. Pay attention to this thing. Hey, okay, good.
Yeah, and I think the experience that postmodernism was most interested in was, in a sense, the phenomenology of transgression. Right? Like, so the first person experience of trespassing on the sacred ground, right? Because, like, the thing about when you draw those hard boundaries is, like, the phenomenology of experiencing true authority, and then the phenomenology of, you know, breaking the rules.
Absolutely.
And so there is a way in which one way to understand the Hebrew wisdom tradition in particular, as Gaffney explains it extremely well in Radical Kabbalah, is that there's an antinomianism, right? So to be essentially having the ability to make law and break that very law in the interest of establishing a higher law. So built into any legal system that is trying to leverage the eye of value to evolve law would be the ability to build in an antinomianism, which is to say, in terms of we have the ability to evoke higher law than existing law. And the only way to
Understood.
do that is to make reference to something that is prior to law, which justifies law. Right? So this is again, phenomenologically, the experience of the prophet and the Judah archetype within the Hebrew tradition is that one who is able to know when to break the law in the interest of the higher law. And it's from that we get the, Thoreau and Gandhi and King and these traditions of civil disobedience, which are just breaking the law in the interest of demonstrating the higher law. Right? That's what's so interesting about talk about practice of like demonstration, like Gandhi's like experiments in truth, right? And he's actually experiments and what happens when you play with the reality of value in a way that cannot be ignored. And that's where a lot of the possibilities for contemporary agency exist, are in the performance of living value, that speak against the the disenchantment of the world and the relativism, would be the performance and understanding and just demonstration of living value through personing, like through humaning. And great sources of resistance are there.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, okay. I'll edit out pauses of longer than 20 seconds, won't make them sweat. Don't worry about that, Wouldn't want to make them sweat, Zach. That's the thing, because here we are
With all the
performing
silence.
within particular boundaries, brother. These limitations, hey? How transgressive? Well, this is a podcast. Better not be too transgressive. But in there speaks extemporaneously to the energy and some of what I'm metabolizing in relation. And then obviously in the context of our dialogue and in a sense, the depth of history and consequence that is being spoken to, I'm always very interested to relate in a manner that is as open as appropriate and possible to the criticality of theory. It's how it can illuminate, and then finding the way, in that sense, speaking forth the energy that is living that tension in actual life. That's what I'm with in that pause. And so perhaps then if it's not quite there for me, I did already spend some time with a sense of how to draw a little bit of this tension out further. and it's like a totally appropriate one, like a deeply generative one. So you are, what is the name of your affiliation with the integral? Is it the Center for Integral?
There's a Center for World Philosophy and Religion.
Right. And did that used to have the name integral in the title?
Yeah, it used to be Center for Integral Wisdom.
Center for, and when did that change?
A couple years ago, when we shifted
Okay.
towards the neo-perennialist frame, we were actually trying to, when we first built the center, well, actually, I joined slightly later, but it was Ken Wilber and Gaffney and a host of other people actually who founded this thing. And there was much discussion. It was almost called the Center for World Religion. But at the time, religion was actually not really spoken about. So then it was briefly Center for World Spirituality, and then it was Center for Integral Wisdom. And nowadays, the idea of being Center for World Philosophy and Religion actually sounds good, which actually shows the difference in the way the connotation with the word religion has changed actually in
Yeah.
about, maybe 15 years. And so, yeah, so now we're the Center for World Religion and Philosophy. And we've got a press, and David J. Temple, that's his main kind of
Gotcha.
like place he hangs out.
Gotcha. So that's good. I mean, it's a further evolution of the dynamic that I'm going to try and point to, which is that integral has been something which has been, you've been affiliated with, you've learned through integral theory itself in the context of, let's say, a center or a structure is relating with many different wisdom traditions. It's wanting to
Mm-hmm.
integrate them in a particular kind of way. And through that process, I'm sure there's been arguments the degree to which, how much of an evolving perennialism has been part of that. You're marking it as a key distinction. Nevertheless, from the perspective of anyone, let's say, or at least the most commonly held interpretations of Christianity, let's say, excluding the deep mystical aspects of various contexts, one might make different arguments there. But from the perspective of an ordinary Christian, an ordinary Muslim, all right, however we want, then integral theory, precisely in seeking to relate with many different traditions and find value in them, and then name itself as a thing doing that, like, that's definitely not the way from those perspectives, right? We've kind of got our thing here. So obvious. But they are, and for people meeting life and the prospect of cultivating their character, living in the world, getting by in society, they are lineages, and they enable certain rites and processes for coming into knowledge, you could say gnosis as well, of what it means to relate with value, what it means to value. Lineage, all at the point, any point I'm making is that lineages have been critical in relation to that, and there seems to be a continued tension, kind of like a critical dynamic that exists within lineages, which is the degree to which they are in fact enabling that sourcing of the perception of value itself. Perhaps in your language could say opening of the eye of value, and in fact not prohibiting what the eye of value comes to see as part of the field, which just is, because hey, that might conflict too much with actually where our lineage is comfortable to go. It can be obviously deeply transgressive and potentially destabilizing for some authorities' view of culture, right? And so we come into relation perhaps with the machinations of power and identity of people within various contexts who have to come to perceive themselves whether or not a transgression or an opening is appropriate or not. And maybe there can be some amount of evolution of the valueception of that context, or perhaps there is a split or a break of some kind, maybe an integration of many. And now there is, okay, at this moment, at this epoch, this is a separate thing. And this is going to be a home for a writer or people, a beacon for around which people might gather to come to, again, in your language, perhaps unfair to use because you haven't explicated it, but the eye of value can say what it is to perceive what matters. And so, in the context of authority and relating with authority, and how that's shown up for you in your own life, in your own process, I'm curious how you've grappled with that, because from the perspective, from one perspective, a tradition or a religion or a lineage could be something like, it's more than this, but something like an instrument. That's not to say the music being played. It can be many different instruments that can, in that regard, play music, and that might be one way at a kind of a maybe a too basic level to um, speak. Go ahead.
So integral theory. So Ken is, of course, one of the co-authors on this book. With me and Mark, we constitute David J. Temple in this thing. So Ken is very much part of this. There's soon to be released these 10 hours of conversation between Ken, Mark, and I as we're kind of formulating the core of the book. And integral theories was very much in the lineage of perennialism. And very early on, Ken identified as a perennial philosopher, essentially. And one of the things that Ken's work did was kind of like bring out all of the best arguments against perennialism. So Ken served as a foil against which all the postmodernists constellated to try to take out this kind of view of perennialism. And one of the criticisms was precisely the claim of the unique lineage traditions, that they were not to be boxed in by a metaframe, that they were each a metaframe, and therefore not to be kind of positioned in some kind of higher order grid, and also claiming primacy of practice over theory. And so that was a very interesting debate. And that was one of the debates that's kind of factored in this work as we kind of reconstitute the perennial tradition, absorbing many of the critiques that Ken had. Like the high profileness and actually really convincing nature of Ken's work is what allowed all of the postmodernists to kind of constellate their arguments. And what becomes interesting is that, a couple of things. One is that it was kind of always a little bit of a straw man in that the best perennial philosophers always were deep practitioners in particular lineages. So like Ken Wilber is a deep practitioner in Buddhism, like deep, like not a hobby. And therefore, was in that. Huxley similarly with Vedanta. And then you go back to like Leibniz and Comenius. These were Christian mystics. And so there is this sense in which the most advanced adepts, which within each of the lineages, themselves end up saying things that are like, hey, respect all the lineages. Right? That like the most ethnocentric, parochial, domineering versions of each lineage are the least sophisticated. The ones that are most sophisticated say respect all the other lineages. And that each one has a unique thing to offer, basically. Each one has really embarrassing stuff. Point to note, the postmodernists were also kind of like, you know what, fuck all of the traditions because they're all patriarchal, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like thousands of remember the cruelties from Voltaire, right? So it's like just the lineages are fucked, so they all have to lose face together. But they all have tremendous, unique, beautiful offerings that can't be reduced to some perennial message either. So we speak about a universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity. And something like an emergent world religion, which is also a context for the flourishing of diverse lineages. So the notion of a kind of polycentric, emergent world religion not being a single dominant global new narrative, but rather the transvaluation complete, in which there is a diversity of discourses that are all non-arbitrary about the nature of value. Because the problem with religious pluralism is that you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe. And it ultimately makes all of our conversations arbitrary. Because what the perennialists said was like, hey, we're all on one big planet, guys. Like, if you all want to continue to believe that you're the only one with the truth, you can continue to do that. But we actually have to find a way to talk. And talking doesn't mean you say whatever you want and I say whatever I want. It means actually getting into it. Like, whoa, what does your eye of value reveal for 20,000 years? Let me show you what my eye of value reveals for 20,000 years. Chances are that there's going to be interesting conversation if we allow it to be a non-arbitrary conversation, which would allow us to all lose face together, which means we get to talk about the stuff that's bad in our lineages and call other lineages out. But then we also get to show what the beauties are of the preservation of the rituals of the high value for 20, 30,000 years. And so it's a very complex conversation, which I think Ken, was bold enough at the time in those days to actually reconstellate the whole conversation post Huxley. And now there's this movement towards an emerging perennialism, evolving perennialism, which is in a sense attempts to try to answer those questions. And so it's key. And there's no way in which the lineages won't become like the core of what emerges on the other side of transvaluation. I believe will be the revivification and the kind of like rearticulation of some of the core lineages that we've had preserving the sacred context since, the anciency. And so, yes, one of the reasons to have the evolving perennialism is to be able to actually preserve the religions, to get them out of the sense that somehow science is keeping them around on like cultural preserves as weird artifacts from the past where humans believe stupid shit about the cosmos. Like, that's not what we want the lineages to be, but that's the way they're held by, the Dawkinses and the Sam Harrises and the other people who just are not actually appreciating the eye of value as ontically disclosing things about the universe the way science discloses things about the universe, right? So there's this relegation of the lineages to curiosities from history and therefore to arbitrariness, right? That the discourses of the religion are arbitrary emotional discourses or aesthetic discourses, not truth or reality stating discourses. And what we're saying is, no, the only way to get that taken seriously is to have the religions actually talking to each other in a way about value and to the public sphere, the legal system in a way where they're demonstrating the non-arbitrariness of their conversations about value. And it's worth noting that the lineages preserve ritual, and ritual encodes value pre-linguistically, right? So it's like the way you actually demonstrate value, as I said before, is not to talk about it. It is to perform it. And that's what a ritual is, right? So it's not linguistically articulated and therefore propositionally like committed to sets of values that we're talking about. It is enacted, ritualized, self-transforming, living value, which
Can
is
be enacted through speech, though.
Which the speech act enacts, but the semantic content does not.
Yes.
Which means that it's about where you are, who you are, saying what you're saying, what you're committing to do by virtue of saying what you're saying, not even when you're making an explicit commitment, right? So the kind of ethics of good faith communication, precisely, exactly. And then, of course, other dimensions of value. I mean, like just the respect that one is able to give through gesture to others and the way you treat others and all kinds of things just encode living value. And it's one way to think about, the book of life as it is sometimes referred to, which is in a sense just this field of living value, which every gesture can encode greater value, deepen the expression of value. So, yes, the lineages are key, and the deep commitment and practice of ritual in these lineages are part of what we need to preserve.